The director of an art gallery, Susan Morrow, returns home late in the evening. She lives in a luxurious house in Los Angeles. In the morning, Susan received a package with a letter from her ex-husband. Edward reported that he had written a new novel which would be published in the spring, and it was unlike anything he had written before. Edward wants his ex-wife to be the first reader of his new book. He also left his phone number, hoping to meet up. Hutton, Susan's current husband, was surprised that Edward was still thinking about her, as they divorced 19 years ago and have not spoken since. Susan only knows that Edward teaches literature at a private school and is no longer married. Susan's relationship with Hutton is also far from perfect. He constantly stays late at work and missed yesterday's exhibition. Susan suggests they spend the weekend together, but Hutton says he has business in New York. But that's not the worst of the problems. In fact, Susan and Hutton are nearly bankrupt, but they carefully hide this from others. In the evening, they attended a party at a friend's house. Alessia Holt noticed that Susan looked exhausted and advised her to see a psychotherapist. Susan wonders how Alessia copes with everything. Alessia said that she tries not to pay attention to the little things. Her marriage to Carlos is a sham. He went along with it to maintain his reputation among business partners. Susan doesn't know if she still loves Hutton. Soon Susan was seeing off her husband, who was headed to the airport, and returned to the others. Carlos praises her recent exhibition, saying it was very atypical. However, Susan is no longer sure about everything she does. Sometimes it seems to her that none of it matters. Returning home late, Susan decided to start reading Edward's book, which is dedicated to her. The novel tells the story of family man Tony Hastings, who is planning a trip with his daughter India and wife Laura. They decided to drive all night to shorten the travel time. It is evident that the prototype for Laura is Susan herself. Their route goes through West Texas. India noticed that the signal on her phone was gone. Suddenly 2 other cars surrounded Tony's car. The man tried to overtake them, but the pursuers kept following. India and Laura began to worry. The hooligans looked at them mockingly, their intentions were clearly malicious. Calming his wife and daughter, Tony tried to escape the pursuit, but the hooligans started to ram their car and demanded they stop. India remembered the numbers of the hooligans' cars, but she can't call the police because there's still no signal. The hooligans began to ram their car again, forcing them off the road. In fear, Laura and India watched as one of these guys approached their car. Ray, who was behaving very insolently, called over his accomplices Lou and Turk. Tony tried to resolve the conflict peacefully, but Ray was clearly not inclined to let them go. Tony can't start the car because the tire burst. Suddenly Ray began to act conspicuously friendly, saying they would help them change the tire to rectify this misunderstanding. Tony had to get out of the car to open the trunk. The hooligans ordered Laura and her daughter to also get out. They had no other choice but to do so. A police car drove by. Despite Laura, India, and Tony signaling, the police did not stop. The hooligans laughed. Laura realized they were trapped. While she was calming her daughter, Tony tried to negotiate with the hooligans. Suddenly the guys started to act aggressively. Tony was ready for anything to save his wife and daughter, but the forces were unequal. Eventually Laura and India tried to hide in their car, but the hooligans caught up with them. Watching this, Tony couldn't believe the reality of what was happening. Ray and Turk took Laura and India in their own car. Susan closed the book, and unable to sleep called Hutton, who at that time was entering a hotel with another woman. Susan suspected that the husband was unfaithful to her. However, hanging up the phone, she was thinking not about Hutton, but about Edward's novel. Lou forced Tony to get in his car and drive. Tony is in despair, not knowing what will happen to his wife and daughter. At some point, he refused to go further and cried, feeling his helplessness. Lou advised him to be obedient, otherwise he will never see his wife and daughter again. Tony had no other choice but to obey. When the road ended, Lou threw Tony out of the car and drove off. Soon Ray and Lou came back together to find him. Ray thought that Lou acted stupidly, leaving a witness behind. However, Tony hid and remained unnoticed. Soon the hooligans drove away. Dawn had already broken. Tony went to the main road and tried to hitch a ride, but unsuccessfully. Then he walked to the nearest hut and knocked on the door, asking for permission to make a call. Soon Detective Bobby Andes heard his story and advised him to go to the motel while the police investigated. Tony did so. He cried from despair and helplessness, not knowing if he will ever see his family again. Susan completely shared his pain. Suddenly a call rang out. The lieutenant informed Tony that his car had been found by a dried-up stream, but there were no signs of India and Laura. A few minutes later, the detective came for Tony and took him to the crime scene to reconstruct the events. Another policeman was with them. Finally, they arrived at the place where Lou had left Tony. Soon Laura and India were found here with no signs of life. Tony fell to his knees, while Susan could not hold back her emotions. She immediately called her daughter Samantha to make sure she was okay. Susan feels that her daughter is the prototype of India. Susan remembers how many years ago she accidentally met Edward, the prototype of Tony, on the streets of New York. At that time they were both in college. The young people decided to have dinner together. They've been in love with each other since school, and now these feelings have only intensified. Susan told him about her brother's difficult relationship with their parents, who are very conservative and authoritative people. Susan also suffers from this. The mother never gave her freedom, and this continues to this day. Tony told Susan that she resembles her mother. They both have sad eyes. Suddenly he asked her why she changed her mind about becoming an artist. Susan answered that she lacked the spark and the true talent that defines a creative individual. Edward wasn't expecting Susan to invite him over to her house. Their relationship was rapidly evolving. In the present, the events in the book and reality again parallel each other. The detective told Tony that they received a report of a similar roadside attack. Grief-stricken, Tony barely heard the detective. He's lost the meaning of life. According to Andes, this horrific crime occurred in an abandoned hut. Someone had broken in and lived there for some time. The detective assured that they would solve this case. Susan remembers dining in a restaurant with her mother, who is unhappy that her daughter is planning to marry Edward. In the woman's opinion, Edward is unworthy of her daughter because he is too weak-willed and poor. The mother asks her daughter to reconsider, but Susan is determined. She doesn't care that Edward has no money because they love each other. The mother is confident that in a few years the daughter will regret her decision, as she herself had been through it. In the present, Susan sends Edward an email asking to meet and discuss his book. One day Tony received an email with a photo of one of the criminals. Detective Andes immediately called him and asked if he recognized this guy. Tony isn't sure because he had a partial amnesia due to the shock. However, the detective knows for sure that this guy is involved in the crime. His name is Steve Adams. He had had troubles with the law before. Moreover, his fingerprints were found in Tony's car in the hut. The police have issued a warrant for him. One night, Tony woke up from a nightmare. Some memories returned to him. Soon he called the detective and said that this was the guy they were looking for. Bobby Andes in turn said that they had not been able to track down Steve Adams, so Tony should be patient. He suffers from insomnia and waits for news. Many months later, the detective asks him for a meeting. Bobby Andes said that after an attempted supermarket robbery, they arrested one of the guys, and Steve Adams was wounded. In the end he passed away. The third criminal escaped. Steve Adams had a nickname Turk. It was his photo that the detective had sent to Tony last year. Now Tony had to identify the second criminal. It was Lou. Tony immediately recognized him and said it was him. However, Lou kept denying everything. Then Tony, gathering his courage, recounted the horrific events of last year and how Lou had dumped him on the road. The boy remained silent. The detective was not going to be polite with him and made it clear that it would be better for him to cooperate. But Lou kept denying his involvement in it. He also said he knew neither Turk nor Ray. When Lou was taken away, Tony could not hold back his emotions. He is absolutely sure of Lou's guilt and is ready to testify in court. Now Detective Andes intends to catch and arrest Ray. Susan can't focus on work. She didn't sleep all night. The secretary noticed her condition and asked if everything was okay. Susan told about her ex-husband Edward. They were married for 2 years in college. After the divorce, Edward disappeared from her life for many years until he sent his new book called Nocturnal Animals Full of Suffering. Susan feels guilty towards Edward. She didn't believe in him and went to a more handsome and rich man. Now Susan feels like her life has gone awry. As she walked through the gallery, she noticed a painting with the word revenge. Susan had associations. Perhaps Edward wanted to take revenge on her with his book. Susan feels like the characters of the novel are breaking into her real life. It's slowly driving her mad. All day Susan was thinking about Tony, who had lost his family. Because of this she couldn't really concentrate on anything else. As usual Susan came home late. Hutton was still not there, but she was used to it. Detective Andes had a coughing fit. After that, he said that he managed to get on Ray's trail, but the police did not have enough evidence to arrest him. Ray left no fingerprints, yet indirect signs indicate his involvement. Of course Tony remembered his face and confirmed the detective's suspicions. Andes ordered Ray to get in the car and go with them. Ray pretended not to understand anything, while Tony barely held back his emotions. It was Tony's car, and the detective asked Ray if he knew the car or the man driving it. Of course Ray denied everything. Tony stopped the car, turned around and with tears in his eyes told everything Ray had done last year. The guy kept denying everything, calling the detective and Tony nuts. Then Andes pulled out his gun and made it clear to Ray that they knew the truth. After that, the detective handcuffed Ray and asked Tony to go to the hut. Andes pushed Ray inside and ordered him to tell the truth. When Ray began to play dumb, Tony demanded him to answer what his wife and daughter felt on that fateful night. Ray began to smirk, and Tony could no longer restrain himself. Susan even dropped the book, recalling how she had once read the draft of Edward's book and said that it was far from ideal. Being a realist, Susan insisted that her husband return to university and continue his studies, but all Edward wanted was to be a writer. Of course Susan was unhappy, as none of his books had sold yet. Edward told his wife that she was just like her mother. Susan was greatly upset by this comparison. She argued with her husband again and soon after met Hutton. In the novel's plot, Andes called Tony and informed him that Ray Marcus was being released as there was no direct evidence against him. The detective truly felt sorry, but he promised to do something and asked Tony to come as soon as possible. During a personal meeting, Andes said that he had terminal lung cancer. Now the management is looking for a reason to fire him as soon as possible, which is why the prosecutor declared the evidence against Ray to be invalid and Andes incompetent. Bobby has no one but his daughter, but she doesn't know about his illness. Andes believes he has nothing to lose, so he proposes to Tony to administer justice with their own hands. Tony is ready to do anything to avenge his family. The detective on the other hand does not intend to just watch as the prosecutor lets the dangerous criminal go for his own gain. Now Bobby and Tony will have to go outside the law to get justice. Susan remembers announcing to Edward that she intends to file for divorce. He is a romantic and lives in dreams, while she is a realist and wants stability in life. Edward tried to convince his wife to give their marriage another chance, but he stopped doing it when Susan said she was very unhappy. They finally broke up. Wasting no time, Tony and Bobby set up surveillance on Ray and kept watch near the bar while he got drunk. Soon they dragged Ray to the detective's house. At first Ray laughed, convinced they didn't have the courage to carry out their plan. But when Andy's colleague brought Lou here too, the guy realized this was no joke. When Andy suddenly became ill, the guys took advantage of this and ran away. The detective, despite his condition, gave chase and managed to injure Lou, who fell. In the end Andy's took the hooligan's life. This made Susan shudder. She remembers how she started dating Hutton. At the same time, Susan feels guilty towards Edward, as she never told him about her pregnancy. Susan decided she wouldn't have the baby. However, Edward found out what she had done. Tony screamed in a burst of emotion. He feels guilty for not being able to protect his family. Andy's calmed him down and reminded that they still had one unfinished affair. Tony asked the detective what he was risking. But Andy's is not afraid of prison, as he only has a few months left to live anyway. They agreed that Andy's would patrol the roads, while Tony would go to the hut where the terrible crime had taken place. It was here that Tony found Ray, who was behaving very impertinently. Tony had his gun at the ready, preparing to exact vengeance. Ray confessed to what he had done, but in his opinion Laura and India had themselves to blame as they deemed guys like Ray unworthy. Tony did not know that Ray had an iron rod hidden behind his back. Ray called Tony weak. In the end the guys attacked each other. It took Tony a few hours to come to his senses. He was in critical condition, but he managed to get his gun and go outside. Suddenly Tony tripped and caused himself an injury incompatible with life. Susan seemed to feel all of Tony's pain, and therefore Edward's. She couldn't sleep all night. Edward sent her an email, setting a time and place for the meeting. She decided to do it after all and arrived at the restaurant, waiting for Edward, but he never showed up. It was his perfect revenge.